Hello, in this lecture I want to talk about the Android Emulator and also the Android Virtual Device Manager. The emulator is a simulator that you can utilize as opposed to an actual hardware device to test your applications. The AVD Manager allows you to create different configurations of hardware that run on the emulator. So I'm going to bring up Android Studio. And before we dive really deep into the emulator, we first have to create a hardware configuration that runs on the emulator. And we do this with the AVD Manager. You can access the AVD Manager either from the toolbar by going up here to the actual AVD Manager right here, or you can go to the Tools menu option and you go to Android and AVD Manager. So we'll go ahead and start up the AVD Manager. This is the first screen you're going to see if you have no virtual devices created. Again, a virtual device is the configuration of the hardware. So what's the screen size that's going to be shown for your emulator? What release is going to run on? All sorts of different configuration options. If you have previously created a virtual device, the first screen you'll see is the list of the devices. So I haven't created one yet, so I'm going to say create virtual device. And this is the virtual device configuration screen. This is where you're going to start setting some of your configuration. The emulator supports all the different devices out there. So TV, Wear devices, phone, and tablet. You can actually create new hardware profiles if you don't see one selected that you like. So if you select phone, you'll see like the Pixel, Pixel XL, Next XS. You'll notice that these all have different screen sizes, different resolutions, different densities. If you select Wear, you'll see some of the common Wear hardware profiles. If you don't like what you see here, you can create a new hardware profile. And so this is the hardware profile configuration screen. Here you can give your profile a name. You can specify the type, whether it's a tablet or whether it's a TV. You can specify the screen size, resolution. Again, most of the hardware profiles are provided for you, but if you have some kind of device that has some kind of unique configuration, this is the way to do it. You can set the RAM, the amount of memory, whether or not you have hardware buttons on that device, whether or not it supports different states like portrait or landscape, how many cameras it has, different sensors supported by that hardware. Also skins. Skins are what's going to look like on the emulator. This is just your own preference type of thing. So you can use this screen if you have a unique configuration. We're just going to select Pixel for a 5-inch screen, and we're going to say Next. This is the screen where you have to select the release you want to test on. If you have a minimum SDK version that's lower, like API level 15, you'll want to actually test on all the different layers or levels. So you'll definitely want to test on the latest and greatest. We're focusing on Android O for this class, so we're going to test on Android O. But you want your actual application to run on many devices. You'll probably go back to API level 15. So you should create virtual devices for many older targets so that you can do your testing. I only have O and NuGet installed, so if you don't actually have the different APIs installed, you'll have to actually download and install them. You'll most likely want to create a lot of virtual devices. You also can see the different releases based on whether or not the x86 Intel based or whether they're not other processor based like ARM processors and so forth. I'm going to go ahead and just select Android O and hit Next. I'm going to give my AVD a name. I'll just leave it as the default. It's going to give an overview of what you actually selected. Pixel. For some reason it's showing NuGet. So even though I selected O, it's showing NuGet. But this is O. You can say the startup orientation, portrait or landscape. The performance of the emulator, you can select graphics automatic, or you can do some acceleration. You should probably just see graphics automatic. The device frame is whether or not you want to enable device framing. Again, I think it's a performance thing. Those are some advanced features. Or these are the advanced features where you can specify cameras, networks. Again, this is an overview of what you selected in the previous screen, but you can see it again if you want to modify it before you actually create it. In the past, the emulator had a lot of performance issues. It's much, much faster now. Well, you should have installed the HAMX accelerator when you installed your SDK. We actually selected that. That accelerator will help with performance as well. But if you don't have that installed, you may see an option on this screen or a prior screen to install it. You should install it because it will help with performance. Otherwise, this is pretty much it. This is the configuration, and you're going to have a lot of configurations, a lot of virtual devices. You can hit the Finish button, and this will create that configuration for you for a virtual device. So this is the screen you would see if you had previous virtual devices created. And this screen, actually, you can create new ones in the bottom left-hand corner by creating the new virtual device. You see a little bit of summary of the configuration for that, for all your virtual devices. The actions, you can start up the virtual device by hitting the play button here. You can edit your virtual device if you want to change some of the configurations here. You can also wipe any data if you have any user data on there. When you create a virtual device, it has its own settings and its own data. Each virtual device has this. And it will be created once you create it. So if you want to delete it or if you want to wipe the data, this is where you can do it. The way that you can start the emulator is you can start it through the virtual AVD manager. You can also start the emulator by running your application. So if you run your application and you say run app, it's going to come up with a screen where you can select the emulators. If you have any actual hardware devices installed, you can select those as well. But you probably want to use an emulator. There's tons of advantages to using the emulator. The emulator itself, when you run it, has a ton of features. But pretty much you can do everything on the emulator that you can do on a device. As we saw earlier, the emulator supports Android Wear, Android tablet devices, everything. The other advantage with using the emulator as opposed to a virtual device is it's faster. So it utilizes all the CPUs on your operating system, and it's actually written so that it's a little bit more efficient. So it runs really fast. You can test a lot of things quicker if you use the emulator as opposed to your hardware device. And now that the performance is so good, there's really no reason not to use the emulator. So I'm going to run my application. Actually, I'm going to start up the Android virtual device in the AVD manager. So it's going to hit the play button. This is going to start up the AVD manager, and it should be pretty quick. You'll see it actually display pretty fast, and then you'll see it start to load the Google software and operating system. The way that you're actually going to interact with the emulator is you're going to use your mouse and your keyboard, but that doesn't mean you can't do swiping. You can still do swiping and everything else. You can also manually install APK files on the emulator to test things out. So if you have an APK file is the application itself. If you have that, you can just drag and drop it. So you'll see this screen when you start it up. You'll see this little toolbar on the right hand side, but you'll see that it has some of the applications already installed on the emulator, like the maps. If you bring it up, you'll see other ones like the browser, the calculator, all sorts of things. So you'll see that it has pre-installed apps. It looks exactly like an actual hardware device. You have the stop, or what is this called? This is the recent items view. You have the back button. You'll probably want to utilize this toolbar. If you select the top one, this will reset the emulator and turn it back on and off. This is turning the volume up on the right hand side, so that will reboot in a sec because I actually selected it. You can turn the volume down. You can put the emulator, rotate it in either landscape or portrait mode. I actually think I turned it off. So there we go. Maybe it just put it to sleep. I don't know. You can take a screenshot. So a lot of times you want to take a screenshot just to maybe show your friends or do something like that. You can enter zoom mode. You can hit the back button here. You can hit the home button here and also have access to the recent apps overview. The ... will give you a lot more options. And like I said, the emulator supports all sorts of things. So you can actually simulate your location. You can put in GPS coordinates and your device will think it's at that location. Pretty simple things to do. You can say send. You can hit the cellular option, which you can modify cellular settings like the actual network features, the strength of the cellular connection, network settings, and so forth. You can simulate what the power on your battery, whether your battery's in poor condition, whether it's charging. You can make phone calls, not actual devices. You can send text messages to the emulator to test things out. You can enable the directional pad, so if you want to, if you have a directional pad on your hardware, you can use that, so you can actually utilize everything that you would on your device for directional pad. You can simulate fingerprints sensors. Pretty neat. You can have virtual sensors for the hardware, like the accelerometer and everything. You can also change various settings. It will show you where screenshots are being saved, whether or not you want to detect A to B locations, shortcuts. I mean, this emulator is super powerful. I would strongly recommend using the emulator because it's just easier and it's quicker. But with all the features on it and all the different device configurations that you can create, there's nothing you can't really test on the emulator. But having said that, there are some limitations. So I should say the Wi-Fi is not supported on the emulator. Bluetooth is not supported on the emulator. NFC, near field communication. You have SD locations, but inserting or ejecting an SD card, you can't actually emulator simulate. But you do have storage on your emulator. Specifically, you can simulate storing something on the SD card, but you can't insert or eject it. You can't detect whether or not headphones are attached or USB things are attached. So there's some limitations, but overall, it's really, really robust. Easy to use, user-friendly. You know, all the different configurations you can create, there's no testing you can't really do. But there are a lot of other features of the emulator too that you can do some research online. You know, specifically how to do the actual swipes and pinching and zooming, you know, things like that, or other settings. But pretty awesome tool. Get familiar with it. Your best bet, bring one up, create a configuration, and start playing around with it. The other thing I did want to show is quickly just showing you how you can start it up with your app, so you can actually see your app installed. So I'm going to leave the emulator running. I'm going to close my AVD manager, and here's a simple application that doesn't do anything. It just brings up an empty screen. It might actually bring up test in the middle of the screen. If you say run, you run your app, you're going to see the option to run it on the emulator if you have a virtual device configured, or you can create a new one. I'm just going to say OK. So it's going to launch my program on the emulator itself. So let's go back and show the emulator. And so here's my application. It says test project at the top, has Hello World in the middle. This is my app. So my app is now installed on the emulator. If I go to the home screen and I bring up all the apps, you'll see that my app is there. It's at the bottom, called test project. And so your app's going to stay installed until you uninstall it. But this is how you can bring your app up, test it, and run it. So definitely create a configuration and start running your projects on there, or just start interacting with it and see how, get familiar with this, because you're going to be using the emulator a ton. Thanks.